So everybody has a very intimate relationship with food, and um, so unpacking what that consists of um, can not only serve the physical form, right, physiology and uh, decreasing risk of chronic illness, but also your emotional health. And so it's worth peeling back the layers of what that relationship with food looks like, especially if there's been a tendency to overeat or emotionally eat. Because what that pattern is perpetuating is just more and more distance between someone and their truth and their happiness and their freedom, and so and their vitality, of course, right? So yeah, I believe food is a potent substance. It sustains life, but it also has the capacity to kill us. So it's complex and beautiful, and so we should learn to dance with it and what it's represented for us, and that could lead to a lot of healing.
All right, welcome everyone to a new episode of the NeuroFlex podcast. I am your host, Toby Passman. If you guys are interested in really hacking your brain and taking your cognitive performance to the next level, NeuroFlex is currently offering QEEG brain maps, which assess the electrical activity of your brain, which basically helps us to create customized protocols to target your unique neurophysiology with tools like neurofeedback, photobiomodulation, audiovisual entrainment, and heart rate variability training. So if you're interested in that, and if you're in the Fort Lauderdale, Miami area, go ahead and check out neuroflex.com. We're also doing a giveaway currently. So if you sign up for our email newsletter, you're automatically entered in to win a complimentary brain map and neuromodulation session. So go ahead and check that out. And onto the episode for today, we have a very special guest, Jillian Acosta. Jillian is a registered dietitian who specializes in functional medicine. She is the owner of the functional nutrition private practice, The Root Cause Method, where she guides clients towards radiant health and vitality. Her approach to health and wellness is unique to other dietitians. She works to support each individual's physiology through the functional medicine modality so that the real root causes of chronic illness can be discovered. She has always been fascinated by what drives human behavior, especially as it pertains to food. Uncovering and uprooting what shapes our relationship with food is, in her experience, what's missing in the reversal and prevention of obesity and associated chronic illnesses, and what's standing in the way of true embodiment, fulfillment, and connection. So, Jillian, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So, I kind of wanted to just start out by hearing, your journey into the world of functional medicine and diet. What was your kind of calling in terms of getting into this as a career?
Yeah, so like many, I'm sure, I began this path as a very inflamed patient. I struggled with an eating disorder the vast majority of my life. And in doing that, I created a lot of imbalance in my body, particularly in my gut, as well as my endocrine system at a very young age. And so I was around 24 probably when I decided to go back to school to study nutrition. I had previously been studying business and I was incredibly inflamed. And I started listening to podcasts and heard of this thing called functional medicine, fortunately. And it led me to an incredible physician, Dr. Karen Koffler in Miami. And I sought her help and then was so blown away by the intake. It was like a 90-minute session initially where she was asking me about my life and my story and how I was birthed and how I was fed and nurtured and all the things, and really taking the ingredients of my history and my story and putting it together and getting a picture of me as a human instead of just like a diagnostic code. And I told her that I wanted to work with her, and she's like, okay, finish school. And so that really shifted the trajectory of my career from being interested in nutrition, not really knowing what that could lead me to being very clear that I wanted to pursue functional medicine and functional nutrition. And that's what I did.
Yeah, you definitely experienced something very opposite. Couldn't be further away from like the Western medicine model of, seeing a doctor for 5 minutes and you walk out with a diagnosis and a pill bottle and usually don't get better, at least with these chronic illnesses and stuff.
Absolutely. Well, okay, so you're right. Like I did do that. I did do that, and I was immediately like, "This is going to lead me nowhere." I landed with a diagnosis of depression and a prescription for an antidepressant that I didn't end up filling, and I was like, "This is absolutely not it." I went to a gastroenterologist, and so fortunately, I think I was exposed to some good information pretty early on, and that was like it just felt aligned, so I pursued it.
When it comes to your schooling with nutrition, like what can you tell me about like the, kind of like your experience in the educational material, and was there like a lot of like differing philosophies? I feel like, in the world of nutrition, it's like there's so many seemingly like very divided camps of keto and paleo and carnivore and all of these different sort of groups that are often like very much in competition with each other and are convinced that their way is the best way. So what like was there like a variety of different sort of philosophies regarding nutrition that were proposed, or what was that experience like?
I wish. So fortunately, I dove deep into the world of functional nutrition and functional medicine as I started to become familiar with it. And this was outside of my formal education. So the program that I went to was with FIU. It's research based. It's clinical nutrition focused, right? Many of those women or men that become dietitians from that program go into working in the clinical environment, hospitals, long term care facilities. And I knew very clearly that that was not for me. So I was getting educated and deepening my education outside of school while kind of not going through the motions, because I learned a lot from those programs, a lot about physiology, biochemistry. I really understand the language of that, and so that was foundational for me. But we weren't discussing grain free protocols. We weren't discussing like normal diets. It was clinical focus, so it's like acute care and research. And so as I said, like the understanding of physiology and really and biochemical processes that are absolutely critical if you're going to be a successful dietitian was the foundation that was laid for me in that program. But then I went on to pursue a master's in human nutrition and functional medicine from the University of Western States, which is an incredible program out of Portland. And the Institute for Functional Medicine, which is like the gold standard for functional medicine, curriculum, they co-collaborated and made that curriculum. So I'm learning all of IFM's. I've learned all of IFM's tools and methodologies and approaches, and that's really where um, I got a solid handle on functional medicine and functional nutrition, I
And
guess, formally.
right. And before we go any further, just for the listeners, can we like how would you sort of define functional nutrition, and can you tell me about kind of some of the different key components of it?
Yeah, absolutely. So functional nutrition is a pillar of the modality of medicine called functional medicine. And what that is basically, first of all, meeting the patient, seeing the person. So antecedents, right? They're what is predisposed somebody to an illness like childhood trauma or trauma in the womb, right? In utero, or the death of something that sets somebody up for a particular condition. So we look at all of those factors of the human, right? Genetic predisposition, etc. And then nutrition is a huge pillar, but it's about understanding how to optimize the body, right? Instead of identifying a diagnosis and then just treating the symptoms, it's about, okay, recognizing there's imbalance in the body, and how do we, number one, take away the things that the person is getting exposed of that is perpetuating the illness, and then give the body what it needs to heal, because that's really ultimately what the body is designed to do. And so it's like it's multifactorial, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's identifying where there's imbalance and helping to optimize to promote vitality. It's health is not just the absence of disease, right? It's like actually waking up with energy and feeling good, and feeling like you're in a positive space psychologically. Like all of those things are factors within the health realm, and unfortunately that's not really prioritized in Western medicine. And so in functional medicine, it's like, yeah, that is, getting into optimal range and in all of the different facets and biomarkers and categories is the name of the game.
Right, right. And I know we've talked about previously before recording, just that you do some specific, like, blood labs testing. Like, what can you tell me about just the purely like biological stuff in terms of when it comes to nutrition? What are some of the key things that people, want to look out for, or might, measure themselves or get their doctors to, do a lab on?
Yeah, so this is loaded because if I had to say one thing, it would be inflammation. But inflammation, um, it can be a result of so many things, right? If so, from a nutrition standpoint, blood glucose levels, blood sugar is one of the most high levels of blood sugar is one of the most inflammatory things that you can have in the body, right? From a neurological standpoint to a gastrointestinal standpoint, it's like systemic, right? And so there's many ways to reduce inflammation, but that's really like my goal as a practitioner is to help reduce inflammation levels in the body. And there's a variety of ways that we can do that. But stress is also very pro-inflammatory. Crappy oils are very inflammatory, and so there's many ways in which I tackle that. But ultimately, reducing inflammation is like my motive, and then weight loss is a byproduct of that, right? Self confidence is and high energy levels is a byproduct of that. But that's really what I'm working to achieve is to reduce inflammatory status.
Right, right. And when it comes to like sort of the like some of the things that you briefly touched on in terms of like maybe leading to inflammation that are not necessarily strictly due to diet, such as just like lifestyle factors, say past trauma, stress. How do you see that like connecting to like what people are eating right now and just like their relationship with food?
This is my favorite topic ever. this is this is my work. So as I mentioned before, in the world of functional medicine, there's something called antecedents, mediators, and triggers. So an antecedent is something that would predispose an individual to an illness maybe later on in life, like I mentioned. A mediator is kind of the thing that may perpetuate maybe like constant exposure to a potential food allergen, right? The person keeps eating dairy, but they're allergic to dairy. So that's kind of a mediator. And then a trigger is an event or an exposure to something that kind of creates an onset. So there are, in those three big buckets, there are so many things that can fall in those spaces. And what I found that's fascinating to me, and this was my experience personally, was that those of us who experienced childhood trauma and didn't have the resources emotionally to process it in a healthy way, like many of us don't, right? That manifests itself throughout life. And the way that it does that is usually because people are trying to self-soothe, right? Like trauma is one event or several events, but really the damage of trauma is the aftermath, is like how we learn to cope, what happens to our nervous system as a result of that, how we feel, in baseline, physiologically, right? If there's so much cortisol surging through our body when we get triggered by something that stimulates the memory of that somatically, that experience is so um it can be so low grade, meaning it can be like underlying that we but it's just it's so uncomfortable nonetheless that we are constantly trying to soothe. And what that looks like, unfortunately, which is one of the most common substances that humans abuse, is food. And so over consuming, emotional eating, is, whether people identify as an emotional eater or not, is absolutely ridiculously prevalent. You can just look at the health statistics of the country. I mean, obesity and being overweight is on the rise in adults. It's definitely on the rise in children, adolescents. And so, in my opinion, it's not because people enjoy the taste of food. Like, yes, there's that, but they are bypassing their physiological cues of hunger and fullness and overriding them and continuing to eat in a way that clearly indicates that there's an emotional component. And so you can see how trauma in itself, just from a chemical standpoint, right? The cortisol is very pro-inflammatory, the stress hormone cortisol. So that's kind of one pillar of the inflammation process. But then the overconsumption of foods that are comfortable, right? Like those high fat, high sugar, predominantly foods that are satiating, internally, it feels good to eat, but they are very problematic, especially eaten, over time, long periods of time. Not to mention the state that people are in when they're eating them is usually like a high stressed, high cortisol state where it's just a double whammy to the system. And so this is where my passion lies, is like, I see people carrying excess weight, and I have zero judgment. What I have is empathy. What I feel for them is like, what happened to you? Why are you trying to soothe in this way? And let's find another way, really, because that's why the name of my business is the root cause method. It's because I believe that trauma is the root cause of many conditions. And if people can access that and give themselves the safety to um, feel what's there and express emotion and just feel, then they can stop using food to numb those feelings. And there's tremendous healing, both emotionally, psychologically, and physically available. That's profoundly life changing.
Yeah, I've had, a couple guests previously on the show talk about mindful eating and just explaining, just the escapism that goes into like a lot of people's, sort of relationship with food, where it's just they're mindlessly consuming usually the kind of food you're talking about, high sugar, high fat, the junk food. So it's just interesting that, some of those kind of common or socially acceptable escapes, like just kind of mindlessly eating and watching television, can be so deleterious to our health. Whereas, it's something that's completely legal and kind of just socially accepted, as I was saying. So, but definitely very problematic. So,
Yeah, and you said something really, like, the word is dissociation. Like, it's a trauma response. It's a protective mechanism, as you know, of the brain to kind of shield us from something that's so overwhelming to our system, usually in childhood. But the thing is that when that fragmentation occurs, and there's no support to reintegrate that experience, then that protective mechanism continues to play out. And so that's exactly what people are doing when we overeat or emotionally eat, is we are disassociating from the body, from the present moment, and kind of checking out to another realm. And we're mindlessly eating. 9 times out of 10, we're not even tasting the food. It's just this protective mechanism, because whatever is being experienced in the body, or whatever is existing in the body, is so uncomfortable. And so it just feels easier and safer to check out. And so I've got compassion for myself, as someone that did that for the vast majority of my life, and for many others, both men and women, who struggle with this. It's a real thing. And of course, there's other ways to dissociate: alcohol, drugs, TV, social media. It's just food is one of the ones that has a lot of ramifications to the health. Not that the other substances don't.
yeah, well said. And in terms of kind of like people getting to sort of the root cause and really like healing a lot of that trauma, what first pops into my mind, and how I initially, where I initially heard you talk was at a cannabis and psychedelic conference in Miami, and I just wanted to hear kind of your perspective on like psychedelics and their ability to, potentially help people, psychedelic assisted, whether therapy or coaching, with the proper integration. I'm not saying just taking these substances and people magically get better, but What do you think psychedelics role is in terms of helping people kind of get to some of those root traumas and healing them?
Sure. So, I mean, I'll lead into this by sharing a bit about my own story, really, and then I can talk from like a wider lens. But I, as I mentioned already several times, I struggled with an eating disorder all my life, and it just kind of like was how I was. Like I didn't know another way. It began very, very early, um, and so that was just the way that I be, and it was incredibly frustrating. And I tried every diet in the world. I was in and out of talk therapy. I was in and out of eating disorder treatment centers, and all of those modalities, while I believe there was efficacy in terms of like some assistance, right? Me being able to speak about it, me feeling like I have support. So they were useful in some regard, but they were focused on behavioral change. And I couldn't just change my behavior. It was how I coped. I couldn't not do that thing. I couldn't break out of it. And it was incredibly frustrating. And I didn't know why I was like that. I had no reference point from beforehand. It was beyond the scope of my consciousness. And so um, I was quite desperate. I was in my later 20s when I heard a Tim Ferriss podcast talking about how one of his dear friends had sat in a psilocybin ceremony, I believe, and had a huge shift in her eating disorder in the healing process of that, and made some incredible insights about the generation of or the genesis of her eating disorder, and had tremendous healing. And so I was like, what is this? And I became, as I did with functional medicine, I just dove into the rabbit hole of research and started getting my hands on incredible studies coming out of Johns Hopkins and NYU, Imperial College. Any interview that I could find, it was like there wasn't many podcasts at the time talking about this, but I was like hooked on every single one of them that I could get my hands on. And it felt very much like my path, my way out of this. And I tried for several years to penetrate the world of psychedelics, and I didn't run in those circles. I didn't know anybody. So all I could do was just consume more and more information and become more and more fascinated. And finally, I was able to have an experience, and it was at a women's circle. So it was very ceremonial and incredibly profound. And I went there with my intention of healing my relationship with food. In fact, I really so naively, it's kind of embarrassing, but like I was like, this is going to fix me. This is going to heal me. I think like I probably went a little crazy with food like the weekend before, because I was like, this is my last chance. I got to get it in. And it was really, really profound, that experience. It it led me down a path of profound healing with my mother, because that was a very tumultuous relationship all of my life. And now I've learned that the mother wound plays a huge role in our relationship with food, especially as women. And there's some incredible books and resources that I can give to you in the show notes if people want to venture down into that portal. But it is quite a portal, and it is there. It just in my body, it feels very true. Um, so it started to shed layers of kind of why this has come to be my coping mechanism, and it led me down a path of incredible healing. And I've since sat with several other medicines in many medicine ceremonies, and what it did was allow me to access a trauma that was buried so deeply in my psyche that I had no recollection of, because that's what the brain does, self-protection. And some very powerful suppressed memories surfaced in a way where I was held and safe and okay by the facilitators. I never recommend taking these medicines alone. I only recommend taking them under supervision by a very um, capable and qualified human being, whether that's in a ceremony led by indigenous people or qualified people, or a clinical environment such as ketamine right now, and soon MDMA and psilocybin. Um, and so that's what I did. And it revealed some incredibly painful traumas, but it also opened up the gateway to immense self compassion, because all of a sudden I saw myself like, no freaking wonder. Like, I get it. Like, no wonder I've been coping in this way. No wonder I've had self hatred and um, just abuse, because that's what I learned. That's what I knew. And so it opened the floodgates to a lot of self love, and and it didn't like rush in like a tsunami where all of a sudden I was like in this beautiful blissful state with myself, but it did shine light on why I had not been in that loving space, and opened the door for me to then start to clear out everything that was standing in the way. And so I don't believe I would have gotten there without psychedelics. It was buried so deeply in my subconscious that these are tools, just like books are tools, and yoga is a tool, and talk therapy is a tool. Like these medicines and substances are tools, and they help us access parts of ourselves that have been kept in the shadows, in the darkness, for self protection and preservation. And so, venturing into the psyche is a gift you can give yourself. It can be, it can take some courage, but if you trust the people that are holding space for you, then you can feel safe and feel willing to go explore, and you'll meet yourself deeply in those spaces. And so that's kind of how I began this path, and that's what I believe these medicines have the capacity to do. To answer your question, it's like, if the root cause is trauma, and sometimes we can't always access that so readily, then these medicines or substances allow us to see ourselves from new perspectives, to gain that understanding of our history, of our story, and to allow an incredible amount of self compassion to come into the space, which is the prerequisite for healing. We can't shame ourselves into self love. We can't shame ourselves into a perfect body, or a body of good energy and vitality. It doesn't work like that. I've tried it. So really the other way is the way. And yeah, so what I've done now is, if I'm focused as a functional medicine practitioner, as a functional nutritionist, to help the body heal, then we need to kind of pull out the weeds, if you will, right? Get to the root cause of why the body is in this current state of dis-ease, of imbalance, right? And so that's my prerogative. So once those weeds are identified, once we can understand why the body is in this space, then we can, that opens the door to kind of the obvious antidote. And sometimes it's emotional and psychological. Sometimes it's sisterhood and being seen in your pain and in hearing your story. And sometimes it's physiological, which go hand in hand. But sometimes it's um, modifying eating behaviors and altering the relationship with food, right? Getting clear about what food has represented. What are you actually needing? If you're needing comfort, if you're needing um, comfort and soothing and console, like, that's available, and food's not going to give you that. It just feels like it for a second, but you're still left wanting that at the end of the day. So understanding how to meet those needs that in ways that don't involve food is incredibly healing.
Absolutely. And I see that it makes sense in terms of your experience. And then now kind of with the program that we had discussed before airing, the garden program where you're working with women and incorporating like ketamine sessions or um, ketamine sessions into that. It makes sense that sort of addressing the full gamut of someone's kind of relationship with food.
Yeah. So the garden is a 13-week program. designed for women who struggle with emotional eating. And I just launched this new round a few days ago on Wednesday, and it's such a beautiful thing because it's women coming together, hearing their stories in the voices of other women, feeling seen, feeling heard, and I have the privilege and the honor of guiding them through the process of pulling out the weeds, like I mentioned, right? The garden is a place where things grow. It's where transformation takes place, right? Seeds are transformed into plants and flowers or whatever is growing in that garden, and with proper care, light, nutrients, proper foundation, right, sustenance, then incredible growth is possible, especially in a community of like-minded human beings. And so, um, but in order for us to really access those weeds, I felt it was necessary to have the capacity to tap into deep subconscious programming. And so that's what ketamine has the capacity to do. So I don't provide the ketamine. I work with an amazing human being, Dr. Michelle Weiner. She's a pain management physician. She's the one that provides the three different experiences with ketamine. And together, these women go exploring, in an environment where they're safe and they're held and they're supported. They have the opportunity to go explore what's waiting for them to touch on so that they can heal. And the way that the program is designed is that there's a couple of weeks leading up to the initial experience. And then the three experiences are 2 weeks apart. So we're making moves. We're doing some deep work, and there's integration, and there are rituals, and there are very intentional practices that I've created and integrated into this work, where because of the neuroplasticity that's available from these substances, we are very intentionally creating new neural pathways in terms of how they process, how they relate to feelings. So if a feeling comes up, their first inclination may still be to eat impulsively, right? I still have that as my first response. Like that has been the groove that has been practiced over the course of my life. So it presents itself first. But because of the neuroplasticity that I've experienced from the medicine and what's available from these substances, is now there's other options. Now it's like, okay, that's always gonna be there potentially, but now I have other avenues, and the more I practice those other avenues, the deeper those grooves get neurologically. I mean, this is your language, but the more readily available I have, like the more accessible those options are to me. And that's exactly what takes place in this container. And so um, it's really something that I believe so strongly, like to get back in the body, to be willing to stay in the present whenever there's an uncomfortable feeling, completely eradicates the need to numb in any capacity. And so much of my work, aside from the nutrition component and teaching them how to eat for their physiology, one-on-one, each of them get a blood chem analysis from me and a specific protocol to support their body and their imbalances. So they've got that one-on-one support from me, which is really cool. But they also have the dynamic of the sisterhood, which is kind of unique. I don't know of any other program that has kind of those two factors. But a huge part of my work, aside from the nutrition component, is embodiment work and helping them come back in their body, because dissociation is exactly what they're doing. And so getting them back in their body, helping them to feel safe to be in their body, because many of us didn't feel safe or don't feel safe. And then creating the self-efficacy and the self-reliance to count on themselves, to hold themselves in a present moment where there's discomfort in the body, so that they can stay and experience whatever's there, whatever's alive, and completely shift their relationship with discomfort, with fear, with overwhelm, whatever the present emotion is, so that they can stay in the moment, feel it, and move through it. But they'll move through it more embodied, more empowered, and much healthier physiologically and psychologically.
Right, right. Rather than just trying to avoid those negative emotions, like just I think accepting that that's like a reality of life that we're going to experience that, and like just being able to be as present with those emotions, it seems like that'll make them hopefully pass and just lessen their negative impact on us. So I definitely agree with all that. Um, in the sense of like, or when it comes to specifically like working with women, just kind of as an outsider looking in, I guess as a man, it seems like women face like so much pressure, to look a certain way, and it seems like a lot of, kind of like dietary or just kind of a relationship, an unhealthy relationship with food is almost like fostered by, the media and just the way that women are, told that they should look, even if they have like a different body type than is what was necessarily like promoted in magazines and stuff. And especially it seems like in South Florida where where you're working with women, that seems like that is definitely a huge thing to just look a certain way. I was just wondering if you could kind of touch on just if there's ways when you're working with clients, ways to sort of I guess help them kind of cope with that pressure, and maybe like, all right, is the ketamine also something that is useful in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I appreciate the mention of that force. It is such a force. This pressure, um, this patriarchal influence of like a woman's worth is the epitome of the appearance of her body. Um, and that couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, it's just an epic distraction because women are ridiculously powerful, so ridiculously powerful. We are creators, right? Yes, men are creators too, but we are creators. And so to have our attention and our power and our focus be so wrapped up in making sure we look a certain way so that we will be desirable for men, right? So that we will feel worthy enough to be chosen is, it's a bunch of bullshit. It's a distraction because what's really underneath all of that energy expenditure is insane creative potential, insane power. And so helping women come back in their bodies is the source of that, because that is where she can access her intuition. That it's a felt sense intuition. It's yes, sometimes it can come through thought and kind of like pings and more of the intellectual, but it's usually like a gut reaction. It's a felt sense, and she doesn't have access to that when she's disembodied, when she's not in her body because she's numb or because she's dissociated. And so it's all tied in. I love that you brought this in. It's all tied in. But yeah, ultimately embodiment work and helping her feel like, so I work a lot with like different embodiment practices such as breath, such as dance, yoga, but like for example, dance, ecstatic dance, closing your eyes, covering your mirrors, like alone in your space, feeling your body moving, getting back in your body is such a sacred practice. It's meditative, it's trance-like, it is so deeply healing, especially for somebody who has been not living in their body for a very long time. And there's incredible power there and healing and the capacity to move energy, stagnant energy, pain and grief and betrayal, all the things that kind of get stuck there unprocessed when they're unprocessed from childhood. You're actually giving your body the chance to kind of move through it, and then what's left is like you get closer and closer to yourself, to your essence. What do you feel like underneath all the stuff that you thought you were, all the stuff that you've defined yourself as, the pain and the identity that's been wrapped around that? I get it. I was there. and I'm still uncovering from the lies that I thought I was. I'm still moving through that. And so yeah, that's the one of the most rewarding parts of my work is like witnessing a woman step into her power, step into her truth, and see herself more fully than she had before. Like really, it gives me chills, like seeing her see herself, like, oh, I'm not just that, or I'm not that. Like it just creates this huge expanse in her as a human, as a soul. And then from that space, like she gets to live in alignment. It's radical. It's so radical. And it's true. And it comes from the willingness to look, comes from the willingness to do your own work, to show up for yourself, to say, I want something different, I want something better. I was incredibly unhappy for so much of my life, and I didn't know why. I was in a marriage that it was not aligned for me. I was in work environments and social groups that we were so misaligned. And I had this thing in me, thank goodness, that was like, this isn't it. There's got to be something better. Like people are actually living happy and I'm not. Like, how do I get there? And what it took was like a willingness to look, a willingness to go and explore what was blocking that. And that's why I believe so much in psychedelics. And I don't believe they're for everybody, but I do believe they're for lots of people in a safe, supportive container and environment. And yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question, but
No, definitely, and I think with it seems just with psychedelics, it seems like there's such useful tools in helping us to sort of redefine like how we think of ourselves and our relationship to those around us, and just like being able to be the creators of our own reality. I mean, well, we already are creators of our own reality, but just fully realizing that, I think, and particularly when it comes to women you work with, it seems just like in like there there's so much as you were talking about like their value in society, thinking that it's coming from like how men perceive their physical attractiveness, and then just being able to like shift that to completely just defining your success and happiness in whatever way that you so choose, rather than like what another group of people like think
yeah.
about. That seems like, I mean, that's hugely transformational.
Yes, and you know, there's a big movement, right? Like health at every size, and there's this like body positivity movement. And while there's a big part of me that's in full support of that, the other side is like, well, not everybody is is healthy at every size. There's serious chronic illnesses, diabetes and coronary heart disease. Like there's major complications that are a result of carrying excess weight. But I don't believe that they should lose weight just to look good or be accepted, right? And so it's like, well, why are they carrying excess weight? And that's what I care about, because if they're truly um, caring for themselves and nurturing their bodies, they probably wouldn't be carrying excess weight. So, because it's, as I mentioned before, it's like when we override those fullness cues, right? Leptin is a hormone that tells us when we're full. Ghrelin keeps making us want to eat food, but leptin resistance, just like insulin resistance, can occur, and it's like this chronic bypassing, overriding of our fullness, and all of a sudden we don't have access to that response anymore, right? We keep bypassing it. And so I'm fascinated by what perpetuates that. And then can this woman who accepts her body at any size, um, can she peel back the layers and enter into a deeper space of self-love, where she doesn't have to be a specific size? She can be whatever size feels good for her, but we can decrease inflammation. we can decrease the risk of chronic illness. And so that's kind of just another facet that I wanted to introduce to the space, is like weight loss is a byproduct of health. Weight loss is a byproduct of decreased levels of inflammation. It's also a byproduct of self-care and self-love. And if your trauma response, if your coping mechanism is soothing through food, then that's not actually health at every size. That's not body positivity. That's not like, I love myself no matter what size I am, because that's not loving yourself, you know? So stay whatever size you want, but love yourself fully, truly, deeply. And then, yeah, go spread your magic. Absolutely.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with your comments on just like the body positivity movement. And there's definitely like some things I don't totally agree with there that you brought up. I mean, I agree with you, but just in terms of that movement of like, you might not necessarily be healthy to be at a certain weight, depending on, your just each person's individual, biochemistry.
Right.
Um, I wanted to ask you, if there's any particular, case studies or examples of people that you've worked with, who've done some, inner healing and addressed some childhood traumas and stress in their lives, and if you can kind of, tell me about their journey and how, then that sort of impacted their relationship to food and their ability to, prosper in terms of their own life and their relationship with food.
Yeah. Well, this one isn't fully about food, but this was just shared with me a couple days ago, actually last week, with a client that I'm working with right now. So she had been terrified of flying, absolutely petrified of getting on a plane, but she's got family in another country. And so it was like really in this tortured space. And she's been working with me for a few weeks now, and she has sat with ketamine with Dr. Weiner twice. And she had this long 12-hour flight coming up, and she was really anxious about it. And so she did a ketamine session once, and we worked through some stuff. And then she did a second one a week later. And this one was like, she came in with the intention of what is perpetuating my fear around flying. And what was discovered in the experience was the memory of her being sexually assaulted. Um, and the day after, she had to get on an airplane. And this wasn't all discovered in the session. What was discovered was the suppressed memory of that incident. And from our integrating together, and really um, understanding and being able to interpret the what comes up in medicine can be very abstract sometimes. And so the ability to process it with somebody who's familiar and versed with the language of medicine, or with the world of that, and can help kind of pull on the thread and help things unravel, is one of the benefits to my work. And so in that conversation, what came through was that incident happened, and then the next day she got on an airplane. And as you know, neurons that fired together wired together. And so it felt like it felt true to her in her body that those compounded events is what really created this feeling of powerlessness, of loss of control, which is very easily triggered on an airplane, right? We're flying very, very high, and we're not in control, and we don't have a lot of power, and nothing we can really do if something happens. And so she was reliving that experience of the abuse, of the assault, and the subsequent airplane ride kind of really um, stamped that feeling, correlated that experience with flying. And she was able to get on this plane for 12 hours with complete ease. And she was like so emotional afterwards, because she had no idea of the cross wiring. So this has nothing to do with food, but it's like it has such potential to untangle events that happen, and separate them so that they no longer exist together. So there's freedom there. There's so much freedom. And so, what that can look like with food, which I've seen so many times, both personally and with other women, is that um, we have an understanding of what happened to us and how we decided to take care of ourselves, what we had access to. When I was a little girl, uh, my neighbor across the street, my little friend, her father was the guy that restocked vending machines. So there was boxes and boxes of candy available to me all the time. And that lit my little brain on fire in a very pleasurable way. And it kind of solidified like this, it gave me pleasure. It gave me like soothing. It calmed my nervous system. My dog is snoring. um like it felt good, right? However my brain registered it, and that repeated pattern became how I coped. And so seeing the events and re-experiencing myself as a little girl soothing in that way opened the door for me to be able to separate them. And now, what comes through when I'm in a triggered moment of overwhelm or anxiety or whatever is I'm able to feel into what I actually need or needed in those moments, which is like comfort and safety. And I'm able to give myself that or call for support in ways that have nothing to do with food anymore. And so it's taken practice, but I've untangled like the stimulus and the response. I've been able to untangle and put my relationship with food in a healthier space, because ultimately I'm just trying to meet my needs, my emotional needs, just like everybody else. It's just the way that I learned to do that was detrimental to my health. And so now
Right.
there are healthier ways to do that because I still have needs.
Right, absolutely. It sounds like it doing some of this work kind of helped like illuminate what specifically those needs were and how to like what you actually needed rather than just something to like kind of cover up or distract from that need that didn't really like sort of get to the root cause, of like what was going on.
Or satisfy those needs, because like even after you're super full and uncomfortable because you've just eaten way more than you needed to or whatever, like the needs still exist, but now you're kind of in this space of like self-loathing and shame and disappointment and frustration and all the things. And so you're kind of like, it's like a big distraction, and then you kind of just go through the cycle again and again, and you're never really getting those needs met. Um, so might as well try another way.
Agreed, completely. Well, Jillian, we're coming up onto the end of the show. Anything before we wrap up in terms of just this whole discussion regarding functional nutrition and healing past traumas? Anything that we haven't touched on yet that you think is important and relevant for this discussion?
Yeah. So most people think that trauma is like some big like event, sexual abuse or a death of a parent or something catastrophic. But that's big T trauma. But there's also little T trauma, which is in essence like our needs not being met, repeatedly. And so everybody, like nobody gets through childhood unscathed by trauma. Nobody. And so this doesn't just apply for the people that have had significant life events like that in childhood. And for those of you who don't identify that, I wouldn't have either before. It was unbeknownst to me consciously. And so when I speak about trauma, don't discount yourself. If you know that you have a relationship with food that has felt somewhat out of control, or it's been like what stress eating or whatever like the nomenclature is, like if this any of this resonates with you, then I guess I just invite you to um, bring in some curiosity as to this pattern. Notice the pattern. Just notice it. Okay, how do I act when I'm in moments of overwhelm or stress or sadness or fear? And if food has been the answer, then consider exploring deeper and starting to detangle that relationship to some needs that you may have, right? And then, in the context of your listeners who are probably really interested in cognitive optimization, inflammation is systemic. You're not just going to have an inflamed GI tract. It's for unfortunately there's neuroinflammation. I mean, they're calling Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes, right? And so that's an inflammatory process from having excess amounts of sugar in the blood, excess amounts of insulin in the blood and in the brain, right? Insulin resistance can be in the brain as well. And so that comes from eating a diet of processed food, of refined carbohydrates, meaning like breads and pastas and sweets. And so if you are over consuming that, consider that it could be coming from an emotional driver, and give yourself the gift of peeling back the layers. And it's not that you're doing anything wrong. It's not like you're a bad anything if you have this pattern. It's that you're trying to self-soothe. And so I have compassion for you, and I see you. I've been there, and there are other ways to deal with this. And if you really want to get your health in a better space, then it has to come from an emotional perspective as well. The two are inextricable: emotional, physical health.
And something just a last question that I just thought of as you were speaking in terms of we've talked I feel like a lot about kind of resolving or working on some of those like past traumas, whether those be like the big T traumas or as you just mentioned, some of the little T traumas, like all the things that kind of just build up, um, and how that can then help kind of heal people's relationship with food. What about in the opposite direction though too, like in the sense of once people kind of get their biology more in order by eating a healthier diet, lowering inflammation, do you find that that could actually also enable someone to like more successfully deal with those past traumas?
1,000%. If we take the numbing tendencies away, what's available is the roots, is the actual feelings. Like if you stop numbing, then you have to start feeling, and the feelings are the trailheads, right? They're the breadcrumbs to deeper wounds that are bubbling up to the surface because they're ready to be healed. I really believe that. So it's a great question, and it's a perfect angle, because it's like if you're that's why they say, like in recovery worlds like Alcoholics Anonymous, like once they stop drinking, that's the hard part is like the substance stop, yes, but the real hard part is the emotional stuff that they have to deal with, that they've been avoiding dealing with for so long because they've been numbing with the alcohol. And the same is true for food or whatever substance people have been engaging in. It's like, let's say, they try to really stop emotional eating, or they're interested in getting their physiology in a healthier state. Well, the drivers that had been perpetuating that pattern of emotional eating, they still remain, right? Like I was bulimic for a long time, and when I stopped that particular pattern, I couldn't stop emotionally eating. I was still had that compulsion because I was still trying to push down the immense amount of pain I was in the middle of. And so that becomes more accessible once that numbing behavior is kind of moved to the side. And that's really when I encourage you to find support. You don't have to do it alone, whether that's a group or a therapist or a trusted friend. Like, you don't have to do it alone, but do it, because there's so much incredible life available. Like, being numb is not living. You can't selectively numb. You can't just numb the pain. You're also numbing the joy and the connection and the love. And so removing the numbness opens up everything. It opens up everything. And so it's a beautiful path. It's really beautiful.
Right, yeah, and that makes sense of like just connected that to people's like experiences with psychedelics, oftentimes like incredibly like beautiful and mystical, and then oftentimes like very terrifying, and people talk about bad trips, but it's almost like that, like it's the opposite of just like a flatline depressed it's like opening you to the like all the different like emotions, like both the positive and the negative, and it's like you can't have like we wouldn't know what happiness was without sadness, and
Right.
so it seems
My,
better to feel something than nothing.
yeah. And my quote unquote bad trip, the most challenging psychedelic experience I ever had, where lots of stuff came out, was ultimately the most incredible catalyst to my healing because I previously had no access to that stuff. And it opened Pandora's freaking box. But that led to just a huge amount of healing. So I'm very, very grateful for that. And like I said, it happened in a safe container where I could go there and it was a quote unquote bad trip, but I would do it over and over again if I had to.
Right. Yeah, I can definitely think of a similar sort of experience that was definitely equally as powerful. Um, well, Jillian, if the listeners want to find out more about your work or get involved in terms of the garden and the program that you're doing with women right now, where can they find you? Where can they connect with you at?
Yes. So my website is therootcausemethod.com. And you can scroll down, you can see the offering called The Garden. I also do one on one coaching, which is exactly the same arc as The Garden. It's a 13-week one on one with the ketamine. So if they don't feel comfortable being in a group dynamic, then we can work together one on one. The groups are cohorts. So I have one running right now, and the next one I'll probably launch sometime in January. And so they can get on the wait list for that. And I'm also on Instagram at Jillian Acosta _RD, stands for registered dietitian. And yeah, I would love to chat and support in any way. I've got resources. I've been on this path for a very, very long time. And whether we work together or not, I'm happy to share those resources. The book that I mentioned before is called Mother Hunger, and it's by Kelly McDaniel. It's a portal, so don't read it quickly. Take your time with it. And yeah,
Great. Well, I'll definitely include links to all that in the show notes. And for the listeners, if you guys enjoyed the show today, really would appreciate it if you give us a 5-star, left us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, and also sharing this episode with a friend who you think might also equally benefit. Would be immensely appreciated. Jillian, I wanted to just thank you so much for coming on the show today and just sharing all of your knowledge and expertise.
it's such a pleasure and honor. Thank you so much for what you do and giving me the space to share my work. I really appreciate it.